There are many well-worn narratives around immigration and the immigrant experience. What is far less discussed is the reverse, repatriation, or even just the desire to reconnect with the land left behind. It's a powerful draw for many, as writer Kamal Al-Solaylee explores in his latest book. It's called Return: Why We Go Back to Where We Come From. He's also the director of the School of Journalism, Writing and Media at the University of British Columbia, and he joins us now from Vancouver. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Jeyan.
All right, so I'm going to start with this. In your book, you admit talking about death and burials is sort of a conversation killer. Yet that's where I want to start, because that's where you start in your book. You ask the question, where do you want to be buried? Can you explain sort of the circumstances behind that question?
Yes, of course. I was in Toronto at the time, and my partner at the time and I were walking alongside Mount Pleasant Cemetery in Midtown Toronto. I'm sure it's a place that a number of your viewers are familiar with. And the question came up, and my partner at the time asked that question, and my answer was very direct: Toronto. Why would I want to be buried anywhere else? And the sort of part of the impulse of the book comes from the fact that that conversation was in 2012, and when I started writing the book in around 2018, a lot has changed around the world, in Ontario, in Toronto, that made me kind of, in a way, pause and reflect and take back what I said, and wonder if I really want my remains to be in Toronto, because this is where you choose to be buried is probably the most, or um, the ultimate connection to the homeland, the ultimate manifestation of your thinking and desire about what is home to you.
Now, you were born in Yemen, raised in
Mhm.
Egypt and Lebanon, educated in England, and now you live in Canada, of course, first
Mhm.
in Toronto and now in Vancouver. Which of these countries do you feel more connected to?
If you use the word country, I will have to use Yemen, and
Hmm.
a particular part of Yemen, which is Aden, where my parents were born, where I was born, where my 10 siblings were born. And it's Aden, as opposed to all of Yemen, is really our home, is our homeland. So I have a complex relationship with Yemen, because, of course, my first book was about me running away from Yemen and wanting to just escape what I thought was what I probably still is a very difficult country to live in, and one of the poorest countries in the world. Like, it ranks at around number 169 to 168 in an index of 100 and some 170, 180 countries around the world in terms of poverty and standard of living. And yet I can't help but feel more and more of a connection to it. Mostly since 2015, when the civil war started there, or I don't know if I should call it a civil war necessarily, but the attempt to defeat the Houthi rebels who took over the country in 2014 by a coalition led by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. So since that war started, the country, which was already one of the poorest in the world, went into what is justifiably called a humanitarian disaster. And connection to it kept getting stronger and stronger and stronger.
You had mentioned sort of your first book, Intolerable, and a bit of a departure. You live your life as an openly gay man. Do you worry about
Mhm.
going back to a country that's not only in the middle of a war, but also very hostile to LGBTQ people?
Yeah, I mean, that is probably one of the most difficult questions that I've had to ask myself, and one of the most difficult questions in the book is, if home is a dangerous place for who you are, for who I am, can it still be home? And I have that question has danced in my head for years and years and years. And I also think that my connection to Toronto, which was my sanctuary, I mean, I came to Toronto um, just to kind of live openly and freely and to be who I am. But I would also say that Toronto became much more of a dangerous place after the serial killer Bruce McArthur, and I began to think about risk and danger and safety in a different, in a sort of recalibrate that risk assessment in a way. But to answer your question, I don't know. Like, to answer your question by saying I don't know the answer to the question necessarily. I feel this compulsion to return, but I don't also know if it's wise or if it's even feasible.
There is one thing to be said about safety, but I'm also curious, language. That's also an important part when you move to another country. You say in your book that your Arabic has deteriorated. Why didn't you keep up with it?
Well, that's a very good question, Jeyan. I chose English I chose to elevate English as a first language, to be perfectly honest, because it was the language in which I saw the creative side of me. I also saw that as the language. I jokingly refer to it as English as a gay language. It was the language that allowed me to become part of the LGBT community, to find kind of my place in the world through literature, through books, through movies, through discourse around camp and musical theater. I don't know if you remember, I used to be the theater critic at the Globe, and that sort of allowed me a place of entry into a community and a place in the world. But I've mostly let Arabic atrophy because it always reminded me of the homophobia that I experienced as a young man in the Middle East. It was a language, to me, it was a language of oppression. It was a language that didn't have a single positive word to say about gay people. The term gay in English has such a such a positive connotation. Only more recently in the Arabic language has the word mithli, which just means the same, become more common. But when I grew up, there was no word for being gay except a pervert or an aberration. So the Arabic language was always in my mind, is what's holding me back from living the life that I wanted for myself. So I allowed it to atrophy, particularly in writing and understanding written text. I can still speak it, but as I found out, and I mentioned that in return, when I went to Egypt, which is kind of another homeland for me as well, because I spent 15 years there. It has stopped in time in a way. It felt so dated. It felt like I have a nephew and a niece there, and they were talking in Arabic that was really different from my Arabic. My Arabic is kind of stopped in 1970s. Partly because all the stuff that I've been watching on YouTube to reclaim it is all like the stuff that I remember when I was young. So I think I say that it is almost like, imagine if Cary Grant were to return to come to Toronto and speak in the way he spoke in the 1930s and 40s. It's still English, but it's not the same English that you and I are speaking right now.
Be very interesting. I want to get back to the idea of return. We do focus a lot about sort of the immigrant experience here in Canada and what that journey looks like, but we rarely go the other way. How popular is this idea of people returning back to their homelands?
It's actually, when I started the book, I was concerned. It's like, am I going to find enough examples from communities that have returned to where they come from? Am I going to find enough people to interview? Will there be a body of research for me to fall back on so that I could actually have enough material for a book? And as I worked on the book, I realized that it is such a much bigger story than we normally hear about, either in policy, in sort of official policy around immigration, or in literature, or in just in our media. That return is a really big story, and millions of people do it, who after sometimes there are different kinds of returns, obviously, but and we can talk about this. But the one that I found most fascinating is the one where after 30, 40 or more years in your adopted home country, be that the US or Canada or the UK, which are all the countries that I focused on pretty much in the book, you choose some people decide that, you know what, that's enough. I'm going back to where I came from. I'm going back to the land that may have kicked me out, or the land that I've escaped, or I've decided to leave in order to offer a better standard of living for my children or my family, and I'm going to go home and spend the rest of my life there, or the final chapter. That to me became so fascinating because it says a lot, not just about our connection to homelands, this sort of visceral, strong, unbreakable connection to where we come from, but it also says something about adopted homelands and our relationship with them.
I will get into some of the stories, but I am curious about sort of, when we look at the type of people who go back, you mentioned that you sort of were worried that you weren't going to find people to share stories. It seemed like you found an abundant amount of people, varying stories. But
Yeah.
is there a type of person who returns to their homeland? Is there any sort of common connections and links to those people that you spoke to?
I would say yes, and in a way, what I'm about to say may sound like it is a privilege, but it is mostly people who can afford to do so. On some extent, to some extent, they could be people who have worked, as I said, for decades and have saved enough money in US dollars or Canadian dollars or English pound or euro or whatever, and then that money goes a long way in their land of birth, or younger people who are much more mobile and who are in a way interrogating their sense of identity and can go to different economies and export their knowledge. So there is a certain element of privilege and sometimes education, sometimes money, to who returns. I mean, it's a big decision. It requires planning. What I've found in writing the book, a lot of it also revolves around buying a home in the homeland. This is such a central theme that I found a lot of my characters referring to time and time again. And of course, we're not talking about Toronto or Vancouver house prices here. We're talking about something, particularly if you move to places in the developing world, and even, I mean, the book also has a chapter in Spain, the Basque region of Spain, and in Northern Ireland. Relatively speaking, you could afford more, I mean, just to put it in really crude real estate terms, more bangs for your buck. In terms of having a home with a garden and having a home and owning a piece of the homeland. It is something that I've noticed time and time again. Yeah.
I want to start with some of the places that you visited. You visited Basque region located in northern Spain and Jamaica, respectively. I'm curious, how are returnees treated in those countries when they come back?
Well, they're two completely different countries and with different settings, and I group them together because the one thing they have in common, I would say, is a kind of certain mythology around their homeland. I mean, there are countries that are where whether it's in Jamaica as an island and the Basque region as a kind of a historically independent. A region that dreams of complete independence. There have been a lot of mythology around both, and their descendants are always attached to these homelands. In the Basque region, I think what I found is that the return story is much easier if you were someone who left and then came back. But it is much more complicated if you are a third or fourth generation of someone from the Basque region who emigrated to the American West or the sort of Latin America. It really depends on the kind of direct bloodline. Whereas in Jamaica, however, the story kind of goes along a couple of lines. They're the ones who, as I mentioned, the ones mostly from Britain who immigrated in the 1960s, 50s and 60s. I mean, either the Windrush generation or the generation that came after that. And there is the other group of people who are repatriated or deported, would tend to be younger, tend to be male, young men, and so different ages, but between the 20 to 40, and sometimes much older than that, of course. And these are two different stories. These are the voluntary returns who return to Jamaica because they just want that piece of the yard, that what they call what a lot of Jamaicans describe to me as the yard, which is the home, as opposed to the ones who actually had no choice about the return journey. The return journey was forced on them because they were deported from the U.S., from Canada, or from England, and their experience could not be more different, but they are united in a way by the realities of life in Jamaica, whether there's like violence, an increasing level of violence, or the fact that they both are seen as come from foreign, which is the expression that I've learned when I was in Jamaica, that they are people who went and they come back, but they have. Coming back doesn't give you the immediate right to claim that land as your own. There are a lot of local people who have not have to would actually say that they are still foreigners to Jamaica.
I want to jump to Northern Ireland and Taiwan. You talk about a spiritual journey, a physical journey. This one is in some case has to do more with sort of the economic situations in those regions. Is return in that context more precarious, given that it appears to be based on money than sort of the emotional connection to the land?
I think in both of these, you notice that all the characters in these two chapters are much younger people. They're professionals in their 20s and 30s and maybe early 40s. So things could change depending on the economic outlook. But I would also say that in both, and the reason I chose those two destinations and put them together is because the geopolitical forces are actually much bigger than the intentions and all the good intentions of the people who have returned, the characters that I spoke to. In Northern Ireland, you still have, it's not although the Troubles have officially ended with the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, as we've noticed earlier this year, there are still some clashes between the two sides, sort of the loyalists and the Republicans, Protestant and Catholic. And then the Brexit made the Northern Ireland story much more complex. I'm sure we don't have time to get into unwrapping Brexit and how it affected the border between the Republic and Northern Ireland, and some of those details in the book. And in Taiwan, you have all of these returns and all of these stories of young men and women going back and kind of and exploring the first of all what was a much better economy than the West after the financial crash of 2008 2009. The sort of the economy in Southeast Asia was far more resilient than it was in the West, and that allowed some of these people to return and find work and find opportunities. But obviously the bigger story here is China. And that the relationship between Taiwan and China, as is the relationship between China and Hong Kong, is one actually of a kind of a return story, the biggest like a bigger return story, and that China sees both as kind of breakaway constituency, that they actually are part and parcel of China and intends. And I have a couple of quotes from Xi Jinping. There is like the primordial, the relationship between mainland China and these islands are primordial, and therefore those countries or these islands will return to China.
I want to talk about the ancestral connection to the homeland, and so I want to talk about the year of return campaign that you talked about in Ghana. That was a campaign in 2019. What was that? And I understand, that wasn't the first campaign. There were many campaigns well before that have have been loosely documented. But tell us about that.
Okay, so I guess towards the end of 2018, Ghana decided to make 2019 the year of return, to mark 400 years since the first ship that left the west coast of Africa and landed in what is now the United States of America. And this, 1619, hence the project of 1619. So to mark 400 years of that moment, of the official kind of start of the transatlantic trade, Ghana decided to mark that with a year of return, by which sort of opened the country to, particularly to the descendants of slavery, or anyone who identifies as African in origin, to come back, to explore the country, to think of it as a second home. There was a really good sort of back to Africa movement that as you said, Jeyan, it goes back. It goes back in time. But with this, it was a very savvy marketing and promotional campaign. Like, luckily, it ended before the pandemic began. So you had celebrities coming in and leaving a long trail on social media. You had a combination of the spiritual and some people going back to the door of no return and the castle, and other places where through which the journey of particularly African American experience began. So it was an interesting mix between Pan-Africanism and politics, but also business, because ultimately what's underwriting a lot of that year of return is using particularly the more affluent or the highly educated African American and African Canadian and African Caribbean in general to help the country economically, to use the resources that they've learned and the money, of course. So there was a business side to it that is. At one point, I thought it was really at odds with the history of slavery, obviously. But I will leave it to people to read it in the book and to see how the country and how people who were involved in the campaign and people watching it from the outside felt about the idea of marking 4 centuries of slavery through a kind of very slick and savvy promotional campaign.
Of course, the last couple of chapters you focus on Israel and Palestine. Again, these are 2 places that have competing narratives over the story of return. How do they each understand the meaning of return?
Very differently, Jeyan. Like that, and that is at the heart. I think there's one way we want to understand what is normally referred to as a protracted conflict, is that it actually kind of revolves around 2 different notions of return. For the Israeli and the Jewish community, it's a return to Zion, a return to the land that God promised to be the promised land for the Jewish people, and of course the state of Israel not long after it was established in 1948, established the law of return, which gives, with some exceptions, I won't get into the details here, but with some exception, everyone who is of Jewish birth, or the Jewish blood, or Jewish heritage, the right to just claim Israel as their homeland, to go, to leave the diaspora, the Jewish diaspora, to return to the Promised Land. Of course, when that happened, is also on the other side we have the Palestinian who either left or were dispossessed of what the villages and the homes that they owned up until that point, and of course that over the years and over the course of succession of wars, more and more Palestinian lands were more and more Palestinians lost their land, and the right of return, they still hold the right of return, not just the right of return to what they would like to be Palestine, but the village, the home from which they were evicted or were forced to leave. And these are two very competing notions of return in general. And sometimes they feel irreconcilable, and sometimes I think, to me, what I find most surprising is that there's a lot of willingness in the middle to work together. It's just that either the Palestinian Authority on one side, or at the time the government of Netanyahu, were unwilling to work that middle ground. But this definitely, to me at least, and to a number of other people, the conflict hinges or revolves around who has the right to return and whose homeland is it anyway.
I want to ask this question. As you know, Canada presents itself as a nation of immigrants, but how do you nation build when you still have a foot back home?
I don't think I think Canada and other countries will also have to understand that these relationships are to our homeland, whether they be from the developing world or from people who come from European ancestry. These are deep and deeply rooted, and there's no nation that can just cut it off. And I think most countries, I just focus on Canada. Canada will have to also recognize two things. For me, is that people have multiple belongings, and they can actually be like myself. Like, I've never missed a federal or provincial election. I've never missed voting, and I take my civic duty as a Canadian citizen very seriously. But I can still have an attachment to my birth culture, my birth language, and my homeland. And also, I would actually say that many of the stories, but not all, in the book, are from people who have felt the sting of racism in Canada and particularly in the US. And I think countries, the host countries like Canada, should also have a duty of care to their immigrants to make sure that they are not experiencing the full weight of racism, and that their stories and their experiences are acknowledged and they're not ostracized. I think what the last few years, in post-Trump, post-Brexit era, and in a way what we're seeing with the pandemic, is that we actually, unlike the phrase that was very popular in the pandemic, we're not in this together, whatever that phrase was. There was a number of differences based on race and cultural background in how some people, and labor, of course, the job you did, and how people experienced racism. So it's not unreasonable for a country like Canada to recognize that its citizens will still remain good and diligent citizens, but will also have a piece of them in the homeland. Like, you could take our allegiance, you could take our love, but you can't take our soul. Our souls belong in our homelands.
Kamal, I have about 10 seconds left, and I know this is how you normally end your interviews, but I'm curious, throughout all these interviews and stories that you've got to listen to, have you settled on where you want to be buried?
I think I have. I want to be buried in Eden. I want to be buried close to my parents, and I want to end my time on on earth in the place where it started.
Kamal, thank you so much for this. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Jeyan. What a pleasure.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.